In the wake of the Vietnam War, the Australian public and strategic community were reeling from a long and bloody commitment to fighting communist insurgency in Southeast Asia. Australia's decade-long commitment to the defence of South Vietnam had been preceded by an equally long counterinsurgency in Malaya. Some 521 young Australians gave their lives in the jungles of Vietnam, and more than 3,000 were wounded. Australia's domestic politics, its region, and the attitudes of its allies were rapidly changing, requiring an equal shift in Australian strategic policy. In the period from World War II to the end of the Vietnam War, Australian strategic doctrine was dominated by the concept of forward defence. Canberra viewed the primary threat as the spread of global communism, and to meet that challenge, the Australian military's deployable forces were optimised around providing elements in support of Commonwealth or US operations in Southeast Asia. The Navy, built around the Majestic-class carriers, HMAS Melbourne and Sydney, was designed to provide task forces in support of the US 7th Fleet, and the Army and Air Force were likewise based and structured to provide elements to support UK or US-led operations. Indeed, this had been the primary organising principle underpinning Australian strategic rationale since Federation. In simple terms, the defence of the Australian continent was seen to be best served by supporting Australia's great and powerful friends, rather than focusing Australia's military assets in the defence of Australia itself. Three major strategic shifts challenged this fundamental outlook. The first was the disengagement of the UK from the region and the Commonwealth generally. The second was the realignment of US forces after the Vietnam War. And the third was the growing normalisation of relations with Communist China. In 1976, Australia experienced a strategic watershed. For the first time in its history, Australia's military forces would be focused primarily on the defence of the Australian mainland. The 1976 Defence White Paper declared that Australia no longer based its defence policy on the expectation that its Navy, Army or Air Force would be sent abroad to fight as part of some other nation's force. This new strategic concept, imaginatively called the Defence of Australia, focused Australia's military capabilities around operations in and around Australia itself. In order to exemplify this strategic shift, the Australian military was renamed the Australian Defence Force, and although it was clearly expected that the United States would provide substantial assistance in the event of a major threat, Australia would strive to achieve as much self-reliance as possible in terms of its own defence. The defence of Australia as a strategic concept had a profound effect on the structure, basing and platforms of the ADF. The 1976 and 1989 Defence White Papers concluded that very few powers had either the intent or capability to threaten the Australian mainland, and any unlikely attack would be best met by the use of naval and air power in the sea and air to Australia's north. This is called the sea-air gap by Australian strategic planners. This would lead to a drastic shift in force structure. One of the first casualties of this shift in strategic doctrine was Australia's carrier capability. By the end of the 1970s, HMAS Melbourne was reaching the end of her service life. The ship had provided the RAN with a formidable anti-submarine warfare and fixed-wing fighter capability through her A4G Skyhawks and S2 trackers. However, her age had induced huge operating costs. Although a replacement was intended to be acquired, and HMS Invincible was offered for sale by the UK government before the Falklands conflict intervened, she was decommissioned without replacement in 1982. A carrier capability was less relevant if the ADF was now to be focused on operations around the continent of Australia itself, where air power could be deployed from RAAF bases. The Defence of Australia doctrine led to the development of three critical capabilities which were all designed to dominate the sea-air gap. The first was the redeployment of air and ground forces to the north of Australia, with elements of 1st Brigade moved to Darwin and 3rd Brigade moved to Townsville. The real meat of this process was founded on the ability of the RAAF to deploy its air power, en masse, to the north of Australia. Even a medium-sized air force like Australia could easily overwhelm most naval forces, given the constraints of carrier air power, if the RAAF could mass its capability. To achieve this, the ADF embarked on a program of large-scale airbase construction across Australia's north. The most important airbase is RAAF Tyndall, located just outside the city of Katherine in the Northern Territory. Tyndall is the home to No. 75 Squadron, which currently operates the F-18 Hornet, and will transition to the F-35A by 2023. With the permanent deployment of a fighter squadron to Australia's north, the ADF could far more rapidly respond to threats and became more accustomed to operating continually in the tropics. The construction of RAAF Tyndall was supplemented with 4 other major northern bases. RAAF Darwin, which has been in operation since World War II, is a fully operational RAAF base and is permanently manned. These two permanently active bases in the Northern Territory were supplemented with 3 Bear bases that were only manned with a caretaker staff but could be made operational in a matter of hours. RAAF Sherger in Cape York, RAAF Curtin in the Kimberley region of Western Australia, and RAAF Learmouth near Exmouth on the northwestern tip of the mainland. These Bear bases are a key element in the ADF's ability to operate and sustain its forces in the desolate and undeveloped north, and are routinely activated in exercises. Through this new basing infrastructure, the RAAF could, really for the first time in its history, mass its forces across Australia's north, providing the nation with a formidable defensive capability. The second major project, which was the result of the Defence of Australia doctrine, was the Collins-class submarine. Submarines, in addition to anti-ship missile-equipped aircraft, are the most effective anti-shipping systems in contemporary warfare, and when used in combination are a dire threat to surface forces. The Royal Australian Navy had operated the Oberon-class submarine from 1969. However, the Oberon's successor was not only to be far more capable, but was to be built in Australia. Manufacturing something as complex as an attack submarine was a substantial challenge for Australia's fledgling shipbuilding industry, but in line with Australia's desire for as much self-reliance as possible, the challenge was taken. Although plagued with early difficulties such as high-speed noise, cost overruns, and reliability issues, as the Collins have matured, they have turned into highly effective platforms. By 1996, HMAS Collins was in service, and Australia's ability to dominate the sea-air gap had vastly improved. Although the ADF now had the ability to deploy sufficient air and subsurface forces into the sea-air gap to pose a dire threat to all but the most capable naval powers, these forces would not be effective without a clear picture of the battle space. Australia's geography poses substantial challenges for wide area defence. The sea-air gap is over 5,000 kilometres in length, and the construction of conventional radar stations would be prohibitively expensive and only provide surveillance in areas reasonably close to the Australian mainland. To address this problem, the ADF looked to a radical new solution: over-the-horizon radar. Over-the-horizon radar is a type of long-wavelength radar which bounces radio waves off the ionosphere to achieve ranges far beyond the radar horizon. For a nation like Australia, with such a massive area of maritime geography to defend, the opportunities offered by these kinds of systems are self-evident. As early as 1970, Australia's Defence Science and Technology Organisation began substantial research into over-the-horizon radars, with a test system operational from 1974. After 10 years of research, the system, now named Jindalee, was able to track ships and aircraft some 3,500 kilometres away from the transmitters. After 30 years of research and development, an operational radar system was delivered in April 2003. The Jindalee Operational Radar Network consists of 3 transmitter stations, one in Longreach, Queensland, the second in Alice Springs in the Northern Territory, and the third at Laverton, Western Australia, 7 transponder stations, and a control centre at RAAF Edinburgh. JAWN acts as a substantial force multiplier by allowing the ADF to continuously monitor all naval and air traffic throughout the vast sea-air gap, permitting the concentration of force against potentially hostile formations. With the completion of JAWN, the Bear bases and the Collins class, the foundational elements of the Defence of Australia doctrine were now in place. Hostile naval forces could be detected and tracked by JAWN, allowing for a combination of air and subsurface forces to concentrate against the threat. Any small-scale raiding formations which were able to land could be rapidly countered by army units which were forward deployed in the north. The vision of self-reliance as espoused by the 1976 and 1989 Defence White Papers had been realised. For the first time in its history, Australia was able to defend itself without the help of great and powerful friends in the vast majority of circumstances. Although the Defence of Australia had generated the development of some impressive defensive capabilities, it also led to the hollowing out of much of the ADF's ability to project power. With the primacy of the Collins class, the surface fleet suffered a substantial reduction in capability. Not only were the carrier and fixed-wing fleet air arm disbanded, but the major surface combatants were badly neglected. The Adelaide-class frigates, Australia's version of the US Perry Hazard class, were retained instead of purchasing the much larger Kidd-class destroyers, leaving the RAN with an all-frigate surface fleet. The other major investment was the Anzac-class frigates. Although quite modern, the Anzacs were built with a fitted for but not with style, which effectively made them unsuited for actual warfighting. However, two events would shatter that strategic complacency: the eruption of violence in East Timor in 1999 and the terrorist attacks on 9/11. John Howard, the Prime Minister of Australia, was in Washington on September 11, 2001. On the 14th of September, he invoked the ANZUS Treaty, a mutual defence pact between Australia, New Zealand and the United States, committing the Australian military to the global war on terror. It was, in effect, a declaration of war on Al-Qaeda by the Australian government. But how would the current structure of the ADF, which had been focused around the defence of Australia, fare under the pressures of expeditionary warfare, the kind of operations which had been abandoned with the rejection of the doctrine of forward defence? Clearly, the strategic landscape had changed drastically, and the ADF would have to adapt. On the 19th of December 1998, John Howard sent a letter to the President of Indonesia, B.J. Habibie, proposing a period of autonomy for the small Indonesian province of East Timor. East Timor was originally a Portuguese rather than a Dutch colony, and was invaded and annexed by Indonesia in 1975. Offended by the implication that Indonesia was a colonial power, Habibie ordered a snap referendum on East Timorese independence. The result was catastrophic for the people of East Timor. Large-scale violence erupted as pro-Indonesian militias began roaming the streets of Dili. With evidence that the Indonesian military may have been complicit in the violence, and at the very least was doing nothing to stop it, the Australian government gained the support of the US President and UN Secretary General for an Australian-led UN peacekeeping mission. The 5,500-strong ADF deployment formed the foundation of the Interfet Force, which peaked at over 11,000. The primary formation deployed by the Australian Army was 3rd Brigade. Although a highly successful operation that quickly provided security for the UN-administered referendum, Interfet showed some substantial deficiencies in the ADF's ability to project its forces. Given the primacy of domestic operations in the Defence of Australia era, the ADF's maritime power projection capability had been badly neglected. A far cry from the Majestic-class carriers, the RAN's amphibious vessels were the two, very old, 8,500-ton Canimba-class landing platform amphibious, or LPAs, and one landing ship heavy, the 3,500-ton HMAS Tobruk. These assets were barely adequate for the task of deploying the 3rd Brigade to Timor. Indeed, the problem was so severe that a passenger ferry, the 1,200-ton HMAS Jervis Bay, was hastily acquired to act as a fast transport. Although Dili is only 720 kilometres from the Australian Naval and Air Base at Darwin, and East Timor was a very low threat environment, the ADF struggled to deploy and sustain its limited forces. With subsequent deployments to the Solomon Islands and a return to Timor in 2003 and 2006 respectively, it became evident that the ADF may be required to deploy a brigade group within this vast region again, as no other significant naval power had sufficient regional interests to intervene. Clearly, far more capable amphibious forces were required, and for the first time since 1975, expeditionary warfare became a priority for the ADF. The most important additional capability was certainly the acquisition of the two-ship Canberra-class LHD. HMAS Canberra and HMAS Adelaide are the largest ships ever operated by the RAN, displacing over 27,000 tons. Just one of these amphibious assault ships can deploy 110 vehicles, 8 helicopters, and over 1,000 embarked personnel in standard configuration, providing more amphibious capability than HMAS Canberra, Manura, Tobruk, and Jervis Bay combined. The Canberra class can sustain simultaneous helicopter and landing craft operations, allowing them to rapidly deploy their embarked forces. In 2011, the RAN acquired the 16,000-ton landing platform amphibious HMAS Chulz, which rounds out a truly impressive amphibious force. With all 3 ships deployed, the ADF can transport, land, and sustain a combined arms brigade equivalent, called the Amphibious Ready Group, anywhere in the region or, in fact, anywhere in the world if required. To facilitate amphibious operations, the 2nd Battalion, Royal Australian Regiment, has now been reformed as the Army's dedicated amphibious formation. 2 RAR is now a Maritime Recon Battalion, and is composed of 2 company-strength pre-landing force, or PLF, elements. In a number of exercises in 2019, the ADF demonstrated a true, world-class, blue water amphibious capability, equivalent to an American expeditionary strike group, the culmination of decades of dedication, investment, and work. It was not only the deployment to East Timor which revealed substantial limitations in the ADF's force structure, but Australia's decade-long commitment to the global war on terror. The 13-year-long Operation Slipper was the longest-running military operation in Australia's history and saw some 35,000 personnel deployed to the Middle East between 2001 and 2014. Additionally, another 6-year deployment has been made under Operation Okra, Australia's contribution to combating ISIS. All told, the global war on terror has been Australia's longest conflict, and the ADF is still committed in the region in 2021. This decade-long deployment to combat operations has severely strained the ability of the Army to both generate and sustain its forces. Clearly, the Defence of Australia Order of Battle was not optimised for expeditionary warfare. The first major reform was to Australia's Special Forces, which were amalgamated under a unified command in 2003. Special Forces have borne the brunt of combat operations over this period, and have also sustained the majority of casualties. Special Operations Command now contains the Special Air Service Regiment, 1st and 2nd Commando Regiments, Special Operations Engineer Regiment, and several support and training elements. This new command structure allows for the concentration of specific assets and capability to support and sustain Special Forces operations. However, it was in the structure of the regular Army that the greatest deficiencies were found. During the Defence of Australia era, the Army's 3 regular brigades all performed different roles: 1 mechanised infantry, 1 motorised infantry, and 1 light infantry. Nevertheless, as part of Australia's commitment to the war in Afghanistan, the Army had to deploy and sustain a battalion battle group in the theatre between, essentially, 2005 to 2013. Throughout this long period, every battalion of the Royal Australian Regiment was deployed to Afghanistan, regardless of its nominal role. Mechanised infantry would be deployed as light or motorised infantry, and would quickly lose the specialised skills they had previously developed. Requalifying for mechanised operations became a challenge after deployment, and the Army struggled to both generate and sustain its forces. Clearly, the order of battle developed under the previous strategic paradigm had to be adapted to meet the actual operational circumstances the Army now confronted. To meet this challenge, the Army embarked on the greatest reform program since the formation of the ADF, Plan Beersheba. Under this program, the Army's 3 regular brigades would now conform to a common structure, the multi-role combat brigade. Each of the Army's regular brigades, the 1st, 3rd and 7th, all now have an identical order of battle: 1 armoured cavalry regiment, equipped with M1 Abrams main battle tanks and ASLAV armoured fighting vehicles, 1 mechanised battalion, 1 motorised battalion, 1 artillery regiment, 1 combat engineer regiment, 1 combat signals regiment, and 1 combat service battalion. The strength of a multi-role combat brigade is around 3,500. By having 3 identical brigades, the Army could now employ a 3-year force generation cycle, allowing for the indefinite deployment of a brigade group anywhere in the world. This sustainment cycle is broken up into 12-month phases. The first is a reset phase, where the operational tempo is very low and soldiers can conduct individual training. The second is the readying phase, where a brigade undergoes intense training including large unit exercises. The final 12 months is the ready phase, where the brigade is certified for global deployment. The Army's 6 reserve brigades are now paired with one of the regular brigades, providing additional personnel where required. As can be seen, the global war on terror was a strategic error which emphasised the need for expeditionary warfare. And with the implementation of Plan Beersheba and the development of the RAN's formidable amphibious capability, the ADF rapidly adapted to meet these new strategic challenges. The strategic doctrine during this period was somewhat of a hybrid model, one which maintained the fundamental security provided by the Defence of Australia, but replicated the expeditionary warfare capabilities of the forward defence era. However, even before this period had come to an end, Australia's strategic environment rapidly began to deteriorate. Driven by 3 decades of historic economic growth, the People's Republic of China began investing in large and technologically advanced naval capabilities. A nearly unprecedented shipbuilding program has, in just 10 years, driven Beijing to the status of one of the largest naval powers on Earth. Arguably, given Australia's geography, the greatest potential threat to Australia's fundamental security is the emergence of a great naval power in East Asia, especially one that is not integrated into the current security architecture. That was certainly the case in the 20th century. Additionally, of greater concern is the developing strategic competition between Washington and Beijing. For the first time since World War II, Australia faces the realistic possibility of a general conflict in East Asia between the great powers, one of which is Australia's treaty ally and primary security partner. It is due to this much more dangerous strategic environment that Canberra embarked on the largest naval expansion in Australia's history. It was in the midst of the global war on terror period that concerns about these titanic geostrategic shifts began to emerge in Canberra. The 2009 Defence White Paper, called Defending Australia in the Asia-Pacific Century, outlined a very ambitious vision for the Royal Australian Navy. In many ways, the centrepiece of the Defence of Australia doctrine, the Collins-class submarine, would not be replaced on a one-for-one basis, but the fleet would be doubled to 12. If submarines are viewed by Canberra as a key defensive asset, then this scale of investment is a clear indicator of the level of strategic concern. In 2016, it was announced that the new attack class would be a conventional derivative of the French Barracuda-class nuclear submarine. Displacing some 4,500 tons while surfaced, the attack class will be the largest and most capable conventional submarine in the world. To put this force into perspective, currently the French Navy has plans for 6 Barracuda-class boats, and the Royal Navy intends to acquire 7 units of the Astute class. Given the attack class's potential performance, Australia will have a comparable attack submarine capability to the British and French navies combined. This is, truly, an unprecedented naval investment for Australia. The surface fleet is also undergoing a substantial overhaul. Although the number of major surface combatant hulls is not increasing, their total displacement will effectively double. The surface fleet suffered badly under the last generation of warships, which were all procured during the Defence of Australia era. Australia's all-frigate fleet is being replaced by, effectively, an all-destroyer fleet. Arguably 10 years late, the 4 aged Adelaide-class frigates have been replaced by the 3-ship Hobart-class air warfare destroyer. Although the Adelaides were upgraded throughout their lifetime, the Hobart class represents a quantum leap in capability. Equipped with the Aegis combat system, 48 Mark 41 vertical launch cells and the Spy 1D radar, the 7,000-ton Hobarts are not only far better equipped, but are almost twice the displacement of the vessels they replaced. HMAS Hobart, Brisbane and Sydney were all commissioned by 2020. Although the current Anzac class is a far cry from the light patrol frigates they were at commissioning, fielding the world-class Seafire radar and illuminator family, ESSM and the Harpoon Block II anti-ship missile, they are being replaced with vessels that would have been considered destroyers in the previous generation. Based on the British Type 26 global combat ship, the 8,800-ton Hunter-class frigate is well over twice the size and displacement of the Anzacs they will replace. Equipped with the Aegis combat system, Seafire 2 AESA radar, 32-cell Mark 41 BLS, and advanced anti-submarine warfare systems, the Hunter class will be much more than simply a generational improvement. They are more accurately described as a new class of warship in comparison to the Anzac. The Hunter class will deploy the world-leading 2087 variable depth, low-frequency active sonar, which is one of the most technologically advanced systems in the world. In comparison, the Anzac class do not even deploy a towed array. 9 of these vessels will replace the 8 Anzac class from 2031. Finally, the RAN will now deploy a much heavier fleet of offshore patrol vessels when the 1,600-ton Arafura class enters service. 4 of these vessels are now under construction, and the RAN currently plans to acquire 14 units. Unlike the Royal Australian Navy or Army, the global war on terror did not result in large-scale reform to the RAAF. The ADF's strategic airlift capacity was greatly expanded to support operations in Iraq and Afghanistan by the acquisition of 8 C-17 Globemaster strategic transports. However, the fundamental fighter force was not greatly altered. Since the founding of the ADF in 1975, the RAAF's Air Combat Group has maintained a very similar structure, with platforms simply undergoing a generational replacement. The RAAF deployed 3 dedicated fighter squadrons over the last 40 years, number 3, 75 and 77 squadrons. In 1975, these 3 squadrons were equipped with Mirage 3s. They converted to F-18 Hornets in the late 1980s, and are currently in the process of converting to the F-35A. The only major change to the Air Combat Group from a force structure perspective was number 1 Squadron's transition out of the F-111C to the F-18F Super Hornet. Replacing the Pig with the multi-role Super Hornets has given the RAAF an additional fighter squadron for the first time since the early 1970s. However, looks can be deceiving. Although the fundamental force structure of the Air Combat Group looks the same as it did 50 years ago, a lot more than simply generational upgrades have been implemented. The primary area of investment in the RAAF over the last decade has been in force multipliers, assets that greatly enhance the capability of the fighter force. The first was the introduction of 6 E-7A Wedgetail airborne early warning and control aircraft. The Wedgetail combines an advanced, high-power AESA radar with a battle management system to act both as a wide-area surveillance platform and a battle management asset. This aircraft greatly increases the RAAF's situational awareness and lethality. The second major force multiplier was the acquisition of the EA-18G Growler electronic attack aircraft. The Growlers perform the opposite function to the Wedgetail. They deny the enemy situational awareness. With an advanced electronic warfare suite, including 3 high-power ALQ-99 jamming pods, the EA-18G can degrade radar performance, interrupt data links, and even disrupt voice communications. 11 of these aircraft are currently operated by No. 6 Squadron. In addition to these high-profile acquisitions, the RAAF has deployed a large number of supporting systems such as dedicated, high-bandwidth satellite communications, the Vigil Air Integrated Air Defense System, P-8 Poseidon and Triton UAV. The 2020 Defense Strategic Update is a clear strategic demarcation point, a watershed between the global war on terror and the strategic era we are now in, great power competition in East Asia. The threat of international terrorism, which dominated white papers of decades past, is now nowhere to be seen, and the focus of the Australian strategic community is now almost totally upon the potential for high-intensity, great power conflict in Australia's primary area of operations. The need to develop capabilities that can deter China, both in conventional warfare and in grey zone activities short of actual conflict, is the clear and unequivocal rallying cry of this document. Some $270 billion of additional spending will be allocated to defence over the next decade, with the annual budget almost doubling from $42 billion in 2021 to $73.7 billion in 2030. But with this huge increase in spending, there is likely to be no increase in the ADF's basic force structure. There will be no more battalions, no additional ships, no additional manned fighter squadrons. So where is all the money going? As clearly stated in the document, Australia cannot hope to match great powers conventionally given our comparatively limited resource base. Therefore, it will try and offset China's resource advantage by investing in asymmetric capabilities, cyber, long-range strike systems including hypersonic weapons, autonomous vehicles, and space. The ADF now has capabilities across 5 different domains of warfare: air, land, maritime, information and cyber, and space. It is in those last 2 that a substantial amount of funds are being invested. Cyber alone will receive $15 billion over 10 years to develop offensive and defensive capabilities, and the ADF will invest $7 billion in space, including a dedicated communications satellite constellation and anti-satellite weapons. The ADF is also investing heavily in unmanned systems. The Loyal Wingman combat drone is currently under development, and the RAAF intends to purchase these in relatively large numbers. The Loyal Wingman, or Air Power Teaming System, is a stealthy combat air vehicle that will be teamed with the RAAF's F-35As and Super Hornets, providing manned fighters with a reasonably expendable wingman that can take on a large number of dangerous roles. These drones feature a removable nose cone, so they can quickly be reconfigured for recon, air defense, electronic warfare, or other roles. The Loyal Wingman is piloted by advanced AI software, meaning they do not have to be flown from the ground, but are rather simply given orders by manned platforms via data link. These drones will be able to take up the more mundane roles, such as defending assets like tankers or wedgetails, allowing the advanced fighters such as the F-35As to take on more productive missions. Potential other missions include decoying enemy fire, long-range air-to-air missile shots, electronic warfare, and even strike, although the payload appears to be limited. The Air Power Teaming System is the first combat aircraft to be designed and manufactured in Australia in over 50 years. Perhaps the most surprising announcement was the development of a domestic hypersonic cruise missile by Australia. Under the Sci-Fire project, Australia and the United States have been conducting research into hypersonic flight for over 15 years. And as an outcome of that program, the ADF is aiming to move from developmental test aircraft to a full-scale hypersonic cruise missile prototype. The Department of Defense has allocated $9 billion to hypersonic research and development, and the stated goal is to field an operational hypersonic weapon by 2025. Very little is known about this new hypersonic cruise missile, apart from reports that it will be air-launched from the RAAF's Super Hornets. We can surmise a two-stage, air-launched weapon in the 2,000-pound range that will be optimized to strike ships, although such a platform could certainly strike land targets as well. We can speculate that the range would probably be in the order of 1,000 kilometers, given the performance of ground-launched hypersonic weapons. It is also unclear what the guidance package will be. The notion that Australian defence industry is capable of developing, designing and then producing a hypersonic cruise missile, a technology which is at the cutting edge of warfare, even with some aid from the United States, is truly something unprecedented in Australia's history. It not only says quite a lot about how far Australian industry has come, but also the kind of military power Australia is developing into. The modern history of the Australian Defence Force is a story of an organisation struggling to adapt to an ever-changing strategic landscape. As Australia has grown and developed, it has become more able to provide for its own defence. But given the realities of the potential threat the nation will face over the coming decades, it will likely require the aid of great and powerful friends well into the 21st century. Indeed, it is this core dilemma which is the continual theme throughout the evolving eras of Australia's strategic doctrine, from forward defence to the current strategic epoch. No matter how much Australia may wish to provide for its own security, at some level that security relies on a wider international order. Some call it the liberal international order. Others may prefer American hegemony. In past white papers, the Australian government has used the term rules-based international order. Whatever terminology one prefers, an international system that acts in accordance with Australia's interests has been a core element in Australian security since Federation. Of course, Australia's ability to influence that regional or international order is limited compared to the great powers, but it is not zero. Thus, the desire to try and shape the region to align it with Australia's interests often requires Australia's military to fight in wars very far from home, under the command of some other nation, often for a reason that most Australians don't understand. This is the doctrine of forward defence in a nutshell. To achieve this strategic priority requires expeditionary forces. However, as was seen in the Defence of Australia era, and, arguably, the kind of strategic paradigm currently developing, focusing Australia's limited assets on the Australian mainland and its approaches is very desirable. During the global war on terror, the ADF did strike a balance between the two, developing impressive expeditionary warfare capabilities whilst maintaining the ability to defend the mainland. However, with the scale of the challenge posed by China, this balancing act may no longer be possible. At the very least, further investments into expeditionary warfare may be very unlikely given the current strategic priorities. It also remains to be seen whether the ADF's approach to the current strategic challenges it faces is the right one, specifically its reluctance to actually increase the size of the ADF rather than just its budget. As technologically advanced as the Australian military has become, its core forces are essentially the same size as they were half a century ago. Nevertheless, of one thing we can be certain: the men and women of the ADF will continue to adapt to the strategic challenges posed by this dynamic time we live in, and will strive to ensure that not only is the homeland kept safe, but Australia remains in the kind of region where all nations, both large and small, can live in peace and prosperity.